Good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning.
How is everything going?
One day at a time.
Okay. Okay.
How big is your father's house?
It has 3 bedrooms on the second floor. It has a finished basement, which has other room, and then two
How
floors.
big's the property?
I mean, it's a house. It's on this street was at one point it was a part of Milwaukee that had a lot of nice houses, and then the neighborhood has been shifting, and so this particular block, which is 51st Boulevard, became a block, and there are several others in either direction that are now part of the Frum neighborhood, or one of the Frum neighborhoods in Milwaukee, Rabbi Twersky's community.
Yeah, did you know Rabbi Twersky?
What?
Did you know Rabbi Twersky?
Yeah, I grew up here. I grew up here, and we were very close to them. My father was one of his closest friends, and they only live a few houses from each other. And so they see each other all the time. Growing up, we got to spend lots of time with the Twerskys. Yeah. And even when I come here, I get to spend time with them. So yesterday, I told you I would do something which I tried to do it. I did try to do it. I'm not saying I didn't do a good job of it, but I definitely tried to do research on the parameters of what we call Ava, which is actions that Jews would take that would create enmity or hatred amongst the Gentiles. I was hoping to find an article that we could read together. So far, I've not been successful at doing that. That was not good. It's just an indication of what's happening. I will say I'm working with like 1/10 of my brain, which on a regular situation is not very much, even if it was fully engaged. But so I apologize for that. But hopefully over the course of the next couple of days, I'll find a learned article about it. But there is this notion that even though halachically we are supposed to act in a particular way, we don't do that because it may cause enmity. And when they say enmity, it's not well defined. And maybe there would be a learned article that would spend time on this, but it seems like a general feeling of hatred towards Jews that would cause Gentiles to harm Jews, or be an excuse for Gentiles to harm Jews. It's not like, like how many Gentiles would have to get upset in order for this to qualify for Ava. You don't see that kind of discussion. Again, there might be somewhere in some learned discussion, but it seems like things that would contribute to an atmosphere of hatred that would eventually lead to Jews being killed, and certainly throughout much of history, it didn't take much for something to upset people to the point where they would kill Jews. Oftentimes, these were fictions that wasn't things that Jews were actually doing, like blood libels and things like that, that would rile people up in order to kill Jews. And the Christian claim that the Jews killed Jesus was often used as an excuse for it. And again, these are things out of our control. There are certain things out of our control, but there are certain halachic rulings that we don't abide by, specifically because of Ava, There are several examples of this. One sort of notable example is saving a Jewish life, saving a Gentile life on Shabbos if it involves desecrating Shabbos. Technically, the law is that you can only save a Jewish life. In other words, you can only transgress the Torah in order to save a Jewish life on Shabbos. But practically speaking, doctors transgress Shabbos, and others, emergency personnel, etc., transgress Shabbos in order to save the lives of Gentiles as well. We talked about why there might be a difference. There's theories about why it is that you can't save a Gentile life on Shabbos. There was Reb Noach Weinberg's answer in Lectures to Lakewood, where he suggested, and he had support for this notion that really you shouldn't be able to transgress Shabbos to save any life, even a Jewish life. The only reason we allow somebody to save a Jewish life on Shabbos, in other words, to transgress Shabbos to save a Jewish life, is because of Shabbos itself. The rationale is that this person will be able to keep further Shabboses. In other words, if I transgress this Shabbos, I will enable the other person to keep Shabboses in the future, and that this is a benefit for Shabbos. This is a rationale that's given in the Gemara for why you're allowed to save a Jewish life on Shabbos. That implies that you would have thought that you can't, which would mean that there wouldn't only be 3 cardinal sins, but that there would be 4. In other words, transgressing Shabbos would be the same as murder or adultery or idolatry. Those are 3 where you can't do them in order to save a life. We were talking about what the consequences are. Is it wrong? Is it still wrong? Or certainly it's not actionable in court if somebody did it. And we had that discussion amongst ourselves. But the rule is, technically, the halacha is that you can't save the life of a Gentile on Shabbos, which means that if you save the life of a Gentile on Shabbos, you're actually desecrating Shabbos. And we permit that because of Ava, because if word got out that we would not save the life of a Gentile because it was Shabbos, it would lead to such hostility that it would end up being leading to persecution of Jews later on. That's just one example. There are quite a few examples in halacha where we sort of deviate from what is considered the halacha in practice. It should be the halacha in practice, but is not, because we're concerned about the fact that it would lead to hatred amongst the Gentiles. And this is what is usually invoked when they talk about not destroying houses of worship, Gentile houses of worship in Israel. So Jacob brought up this issue yesterday, which is whether or not these have a status of avodah zarah nowadays, these houses of worship. Again, I wanted to first make a distinction between certain beliefs of Gentiles and then whether or not what the Gentiles involve, like in other words, if they have elements of what we would call avodah zarah in them. So does the avodah zarah part, even if they're, so for instance, let's say you have Christians who believe in the Trinity, so Ramosha Israelish and others suggest that may not constitute idolatry or
polytheism.
Polytheism. Well, it may not constitute that, and in other words, it may be a philosophical, theological mistake that they're making. But shituf what he calls shituf. Shituf means combining. So you're combining something else with God. Combining something else with God may not be prohibited for Gentiles. It might be a mistake in monotheism, but it's not prohibited for Gentiles. But let's say you take their belief in the two powers. This is something that I've personal experience with, because there are a lot of beliefs, a lot of things that we assume to be Christian beliefs that are actually not agreed upon by all Christians. So let's say the Catholics have certain rites that some people might consider idolatrous, like the taking of the sacrament, where they suggest that the wafer is the body of Jesus and the blood, and drinking the wine is the blood. Let's say somebody considers that avodah zarah. One of the reasons you might consider that avodah zarah is because they're using elements of worship that come from the Beis Hamikdash. They're using elements of worship to worship something else. So, and this is one of the categories of avodah zarah. So if you pour wine to an idol, or if you offer a sacrifice to an idol, or you bow to an idol, if you burn incense to an idol. So these, to a foreign, we'll call it not an idol, a foreign deity, like some kind of foreign deity. So those are considered to be
Alien?
they're considered to be fundamental avodah zarah. There's like certain things, the Gemara says this, and it's the Rambam says this. There, based on the Gemara, there are certain services which are considered so fundamental that it doesn't matter who you're doing it to. It doesn't even matter if they do it the way you're doing it. But if you do these kinds of things, that's considered idolatry. So let's say you have something like that. So a lot of people like to focus on the sacrament. There are evangelicals don't have that. They don't have that whole thing. So let's say you're in the United States and you're talking about evangelical churches, and that was one of your focuses, one of your indications of avodah zarah. They don't have that. Some of them, a lot of the evangelicals do not have Jesus on the cross. There's some people who focus on Jesus on the cross as a idolatry, and that if you kneel in front of Jesus on the cross, that would be the equivalent of bowing before an idol. But again, they don't have Jesus on a cross in many evangelical churches. But one of the things they do, and this is more an element of belief. You don't see this in worship as much, but they do have the belief in two powers. They believe that there's a power of light and a power of darkness. They believe that the devil is a separate force, not in the control of God. And I've had this discussion even with evangelical pastors who consider themselves to be very close to Judaism. Give me 1 second here. So, so, and this is considered to be polytheistic, any kind of ritual associated with the devil. Again, I don't know. The only one I can think of is exorcism, and that one may not be a forbidden ritual. I don't know.
There's some of that stuff in the Gemara.
What?
There's some of that stuff in the Gemara, I believe. Not the devil necessarily, but the other stuff. Like
Yes.
This is a demon, and this is an exorcism.
Right, but again, one of the differences here is not that there's a force of evil, but rather that there's a force separate from control of God. The Torah in Yeshayahu, he makes the statement, but this is clearly something that is implied in the rest of Tanakh, but he says, Yotzer Or, God formed light, Uvori Choshech, created darkness, Oseh Shalom, he makes peace, Uvarei et hara, and he created evil. And so monotheism, one of the real challenges of monotheism is that evil is also from God. So to believe that evil is not from God, that's polytheism, that it is somehow separate from God. So even though there's an acknowledgement of the existence of evil right from the beginning of the Torah, it says that there's a tree of Tov and Ra. So the existence of Ra is acknowledged very early, but God is the creator of it. He forms it, he creates it, he's the master of it, he's the source of it. So there are forces of evil in the world, but they all find their source in God. To say that there's a separate force of evil is polytheism. And so that's just an example of the fact that there are what you would call pagan influences, even if you're going to say that the belief in the Trinity is itself not idolatry for Christians, but there are many pagan influences and practices that have come into the church. So the question would be, even if you would say to yourself that this particular Christian person should not be treated as an idolater, like we saw from the Meiri and others and the Ramah, Ramoshe Isulish, even if we don't consider them idolaters per se, that doesn't mean that in their worship there isn't idolatry. Again, it may be a mistake for them. It may be an accident for them. They certainly don't think that they're polytheistic or pagan, but there are all sorts of rituals that come up. Now, we even have to consider innocent practices like trick-or-treating or Christmas trees or things like that. Do they amount to a pagan symbol or a pagan practice that somehow found its way into? No, they don't trick-or-treat in a Christian church, but in other words, we find ourselves, even though in general you may say that I don't think of this person as pagan, or I don't, but there may be practices that are included in their worship or in their faith that would be. So the churches, so let's say you have churches, especially Eastern Orthodox churches that have a lot of iconography, and they also include worship of saints. The Catholic Church has worship of saints. There are those who suggest that the saint worship is a relic from polytheistic times, and so if and there are those who do. I'm just saying there are many who consider these to be relics of paganism, even halachically today. The rule is you're not supposed to enter a church. You're not supposed to go into a church. So there's all sorts of discussion about that. Rabbi Riskin, he was famous for permitting, and I think he even went to them. He went to the churches that have famous artwork. His argument was, it's clear I'm going in for the artwork. I'm not going in for any kind of worship. But he's an outlier. It's very rare that you would find a halachic personality that would permit even entering churches. And I asked Rabbi, here, let me help you.
No, I don't need it. It's right there. Don't go anywhere. Just stay there a minute, Howard. Just one of these.
So I once asked, there was a guy who worked for a homeless shelter, and at one point he asked me, is he allowed to, this particular homeless shelter was in a church, so he asked me, am I allowed to enter the church to work with the people in the homeless shelter? And so so I asked Rabbi first this question, Rabbi Shmuel first, and he told me he cannot. I said, does it make a difference what kind of church it is? Does it make a difference what if it's a church that has doesn't even have any image of Jesus? It might have some crosses, but doesn't have any image of Jesus. Let's say it's an evangelical church. And he said, it doesn't make a difference. So, but there are times when they make an exception, and those exceptions are for things like AA meetings and stuff, because they consider it a matter close to an issue of life and death for them to go to these AA meetings. But even then, they require that it's like in some side room. So with regard to certain rules, you see that, and I'm citing him as what you're gonna find, not because he's not an outlier. That's why I'm trying to bring it up. What you will find when you speak to people that are talking about the practical halachic issues that have to do with avodah zarah, you're going to find that it's going to be very rare to get from an Orthodox rabbi, obviously, very rare to get a permit even to step inside of a church. Again, there have been exceptions, like for instance, the case, that what we're talking about with AA meetings. There also is exceptions for people who are considered to have the ear of the king. So we've talked about that also in the past. So you have Rabbi Jonathan Sachs attended. He was in the Westminster Abbey I think he was there for Charles and Diana's wedding. But he was present in Westminster Abbey, not just. I think there was even a mass at one of the events, if it's a coronation or a mass. But certainly, Chief Rabbi Mervis was at the coronation of Charles recently, and he also, there is this permit that's given to certain people who are said to have the ear of the king. And again, even that permit is really based on the salvation of the Jewish people. It's like an exception of exceptions to the rule. But it was very much spoken about. And I've mentioned in the past Haskell Lookstein, Rabbi Haskell Lookstein, who's the rabbi of B'nai Jeshurun, and he was the longtime rabbi on the Upper East Side. He attended Barack Obama's inauguration. I think it was called a mass in Washington, D.C. He argued that he had the ear of the king because he was invited by Barack Obama to come to it. And therefore he had that permit. He was actually censored by the Rabbinical Council of America because for being there, because they felt that he shouldn't have. So you see now, it's still a bit of a leap to go from these indications to say that you have to outright destroy them, to destroy them. But you do see that these houses of worship, even though you could split hairs about whether the Trinity is considered idolatry, you still see the treatment of the houses of worship of Christians in this light. Practically, I'm just telling you about the stuff that as I've seen it, and that suggests to me that there are other concerns, not just concerns about the Trinity, but there's concerns about other elements of worship that go on in there. I did see that when it comes to the halacha itself, that the halacha, that the Rambam is quoted. The Rambam is a couple hundred years before the halachic work, the Tur. The halachic work, the Tur, Tet Vav Reish. He's called Rav Yaakov, the author of the Tur. He's actually the son of Rabbeinu Asher, who was a exceedingly important halachic authority. And he wrote a seminal work, which the Shulchan Aruch is really based on. The Shulchan Aruch is an elaboration on the writings of the Torah. So he is often quoted as saying that the mitzvah does apply. The difference between the mitzvah, the Torah I'm talking about, the Torah says that the mitzvah of destroying houses of worship applies in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. The difference between Eretz Yisrael and outside Eretz Yisrael is that in Eretz Yisrael, you have to go out of your way to destroy them. In other words, if you hear about one somewhere, you have to actually go there and destroy it, because Israel's not supposed to have, it's part of the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, that it's not supposed to have houses of idolatry. Outside of Israel, you don't have to go out of your way to destroy them. But if you, let's say, captured a territory and outside of Israel, then or took it over, then it would be a mitzvah to destroy it. I know there are a few synagogues that purchased churches, and then for the purpose of having a shul there. And there were all manner of complications as to what you have to do beforehand. The yeshiva in Milwaukee bought their property from originally it was some wealthy person's house, but then it became a nunnery. And then the Witts bought it, the Wisconsin Institute of Torah Study, and there was a chapel that was part of this building. So I don't know all the details, but they did have to go through certain steps in order to sort of declassify it from whatever state it was in before. And I remember there's a shul in West Riders Park, which I know well, but its name has left me, that they bought their building from a church, and they had to wait like a year or two before they could. There were all sorts of, and again, I don't know the details, but there were all sorts of measures that needed to be taken to sort of somehow qualify as destroying the church. And the church couldn't continue to exist, even the structure, without some action taken. Now, they didn't have to actually burn it to the ground when they were doing it, but they did have to take some kind of action. Because it had been a church before. So he makes that distinction. In Israel, the mitzvah, there's two. So the way the Vilna Gaon distinguishes it, there's like two mitzvahs. There, he says the Rambam holds this too, even though our mitzvah does not mention outside of Israel, it only mentions in Israel. The explanation that there are many sort of latter-day commentaries, and when I say latter-day, even like in the 13, 14, 1500s, I mean, later than the Rambam, that suggests that the Rambam, it has to be like more like 1400, 1500s, that suggests that the Tur and the Rambam agree. The Rambam only mentioned Eretz Yisrael because in Eretz Yisrael there's a mitzvah to proactively go and destroy it, as opposed to outside of Israel, where you would only have to destroy it if it sort of came into your hands. And not only that, but the Rabbi Kiva Eger actually includes a text for the blessing that you say when you destroy Avodah Zorah in Israel. But he doesn't actually say in Israel. There are commentaries on Rabbi Kiva Eger that wonder, about whether he should have added the words in this place. He doesn't say one way or the other where it is, but he actually includes a bracha for destroying Avodah Zarah. Many think afterwards that he meant Avodah Zarah in Israel. So it seems like they considered it halachic, and that it would apply even in our time, not just in older medieval times, but even in our time. So again, and when I briefly listened to somebody, there was a shiur from YU. He didn't go into it. I was hoping he was going to go into it, but he just said, of course, we can't do it today. He just sort of says it like that, but he doesn't go into the thought process of how Ava is applied and who gets to apply it. Do you have to go to rabbinic authority and they tell you that you have to apply it? It seems like it's a kind of gut feeling that that people have. Sort of like when people talk about not building the Beis Hamikdash nowadays. Why is it that, you'll hear some certain people when they're talking about why don't we just build the Beis Hamikdash right now, you'll hear people just say, well, we can't do that. It would lead to World War III. But who said that? Was there a convention? Was there some kind of a committee set up to research whether it'll cause World War III if we build a Beis Hamikdash? Or is it just a kind of gut feeling that the population has?
I think that's kind of the point. A lot of the people, whether this government in the Middle East or that one, they all want World War III, even though the people don't. That's
right.
Most of these
Yeah,
wars
so I
are
don't think anybody
planned out.
argues. I don't think people, I don't think
We're
that
supposed to
many
wait for the
people argue.
Mashiach. So it's
Right.
like it's heretical.
Right, but we saw that there's a mitzvah to have a Beis Hamikdash, and it doesn't say anywhere in any halachic work like the Rambam or the Shulchan Aruch or anywhere. It doesn't say that you have to wait to. It is a discussion. It is a discussion about, because there are teachings that the Beis Hamikdash is only going to be built when Mashiach comes, and it's going to be miraculous. But if you look in the halachic, this comes up practically, because can you bring korbanos nowadays? There are a lot of authorities who suggest that you could bring a korban. Last year I was in Israel for Pesach. I was absolutely certain that somebody was going to bring a lamb and bring a korban Pesach. It did not happen, and the reason it did not happen is that even the very sort of what are considered right-wing members of the religious community in Israel felt that it was too dangerous to do it, so they sort of quashed it. So anyways, the reason I'm sort of interested in Ava in general is because it's one of these things which can lead to actually violating Shabbos technically. You just say it's Ava. If we did it, there's going to be pogroms, and therefore we can't do it. And so you would think that there would have to be halachic guidelines as to when you apply Ava and when you don't. And it's sort of interesting. One of the things that interests me is that we by the way, we had this with Rove. This is David and Lois and I had this discussion years ago about the concept of a Rove, that you have to follow the majority. So there's different kinds of Rove, and there's one Rove that's called Ruba Delesa Kamon. It means it's a majority that's not in front of us. So like, let's say somebody says a majority of people nowadays do such and such or think such and such. So the Gemara has a lot of those. The Gemara has a lot of them. But so the question is, how did they get to that determination? How did they get to that determination? Was there a meeting? Did they do a survey? It does not look, there's rare circumstances where it says that they've ever done a survey. So so it seems like there's a gut kind of discussion, like whoever the Chief Justice was, who says, it was about pornography. He said something like, I know pornography when I see it. In other words, you don't need to have some kind of definition for what it is. You sort of know what it is when you see it. So it sounded something like that when it came to a lot of these roves, that there's a kind of gut sense. But even so, whose gut? At what point, like, whose gut are we relying on? Or do we just say, no, some judge in some court case, he evokes this rove because it's just obvious to him that this is the case, and he's allowed to do that. So this with Ava, this determination of Ava, you just would wonder. I think it's not a complete anomaly. Like, again, you see something like it with Rove and other things, but you would think that there should be some discussion about it, because if there aren't parameters for it, it makes it, we'll call it interesting. It makes it extremely interesting.
To go
There
back,
was a famous case. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I hate to interrupt you, but there was a
Yeah.
famous case, but, what I want to say, I'm sorry,
To go.
No rush, no rush.
okay, in the case of hatred
Yeah,
and enmity and looking forward to something that's made possible, something that's it's not certain what's going to happen in the future, and we give up one of our stand. Where do we find a precedent for that? Unless you want to say everything is a time of stress, and the courts have special power, but where in the thing do we find it? We find lots of cases in Shas of like with besieged city, and they ask for the guy, so everybody dies. It's the same thing. You're going to have, it's not enmity necessarily, but you're going to have a lot of people die, or the destruction of the second base Hamikdash because of the Chachamim. They said that it's not a kosher korban. We can't permit
Zechariah
it.
ben Avkulis. Zechariah
Right.
ben Avkulis.
What a man.
Yochanan does criticize him. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, so this would be a good those would be a series of contrasting laws that would make us even more curious about Ava, because there do seem to be times where you allow a lot of people to die. You could have let one person die, but a lot of people died. So your first case was they're calling out somebody. They just want a human sacrifice, a Jewish sacrifice. So they say, throw us out one person and we'll let the rest of you live.
Logically, if they ask for someone in particular, you're supposed to give that particular person up, especially if he's done
Exactly.
a crime or something.
Exactly.
But if they're just asking for one guy, you don't got to.
You're not supposed to give. Yeah. So in that,
and they might ask for another and another and another. But
all right. So that's part of it. That might be part of it, but part of it might be that it'll never end. That might be part of it, but it's not like the stated point of it. So there you could have, let's say, you could have thousands of people die because you didn't want to have, the one person die. So that might be, again, these would be interesting contrasts that they may not stand up, but they would be for this subject that makes the subject of Ava even more interesting. And there certainly are, for instance, the mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. So there is a discussion about whether it's an obligatory mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. There are many halachic authorities over times who held that it's an obligatory mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam does not count it as one of his 613 mitzvahs. There's a whole discussion about why he doesn't, but there are many who consider it an obligatory. Even today, there are many poskim who hold it's an obligatory mitzvah today. They happen to all be in Israel.
I think Rambam's right on that, though.
Right, but even the Rambam, there are a lot of people who hold the Rambam still holds it. He just didn't list it for technical reasons. Even the Rambam's position is a bit fuzzy, but many people, even though again, there might be quite a few people who hold it's not a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael, but you're allowed to. You're certainly allowed to live in Eretz Yisrael, even though living in Eretz Yisrael inflames. Nobody's, for instance, saying nowadays Jews shouldn't make Aliyah because making Aliyah will cause wars. Gaza and all these. It's just the latest example of deaths being caused because Jews decided to live in Eretz Yisrael. So somebody, based on the thing of Ava, why doesn't somebody come out and say Jews just shouldn't live in Eretz Yisrael? Just don't live in Eretz Yisrael. But they don't.
I think there was it was not that, I mean, maybe it wasn't that, it was just on theological grounds and halachic grounds that it's not acceptable to make aliyah and do all this stuff.
There were people in mainly it was the Satmar Rebbe who's most
I'm
famous.
talking about in like 1800s, like Zionism was heretic back then.
No, not because of living in Eretz Yisrael,
But the whole idea of it, the secular idea of it.
only because of the secular, that was because of the mixture of the secular ideology, but not the living in Eretz Yisrael. I mean,
I meant
you had the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon, you had the students of the Vilna Gaon and the students of the Baal Shem Tov, both moving in the 1800s, not in mass, but very significant Talmidim, students of the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov that moved to Eretz Yisrael, that believed that the Ramban moved to Eretz Yisrael, and he believed that there was a mitzvah chiyuvus to live there. And if you look at if you sort of follow the trail of it, you'll see that this is one of those things where the people who hold that you don't have to live there usually are the ones that have like a burden of proof in the conversation about it, because it seems pretty stacked up. Even just a reading of Tanakh suggests that it was the assumption that Jewish people are going to live in Eretz Yisrael, and there's always going to be Jews in Eretz Yisrael. And if there aren't Jews in Eretz Yisrael, it's a bad sign for the Jews, because there's supposed to be Jews in Eretz Yisrael. There's a whole chunk of mitzvahs that only apply in Eretz Yisrael. All the mitzvahs, and the Beis Hamikdash is going to be in Eretz Yisrael. The Sanhedrin is supposed to be in Eretz Yisrael. The king is supposed to be a Jewish king in the land of Israel. So the basic institutions, there's the Nevuah, prophecy. The Yechezkel gives a prophecy outside of Eretz Yisrael, and all the commentaries are trying to wonder how is he able to do it? Because prophecy only is supposed to happen in Eretz Yisrael. It works with Yechezkel because he's on a river and certain other things, but even prophecy. So you have like the main institutional bodies of the Jewish people. They are all supposed to happen in Eretz Yisrael. Again, if you look at Tanakh, where the Jewish people are supposed to be in Eretz Yisrael as a nation, whether that applies to every individual, it's, and certainly even the ones who hold you have to live there agree there are exceptions to the rule. But there you have something. If there's a problem with Ava, say Jews shouldn't live in Eretz Yisrael. We should just move out of Israel. There were poskim, by the way. There were poskim who were suggesting you shouldn't move across a green line. I remember this when my brother was looking to buy an apartment. So this is in the early 1980s. He was looking to buy an apartment, and he went to Rav Shach, and Rav Shach says, don't buy beyond the green line. Rav Shach said. Now, it could be that part of it was also that he thought they're going to give it back. Eventually, he thought the government was going to give it back, and it wasn't a smart financial move. But he did tell him, don't move beyond the green line. And you could imagine that there were people who felt that if you're that let's say building settlements in contested areas is going to inflame people's furor, and it's going to cause could potentially cause violence. But you do not hear a broad halachic statement like that, and so
Israel's
that's
a secular state. So it's also it really is not like if the students of the Baal Shem Tov, and what's that famous rabbi that
the
one that planted all the esrogim in Eretz Yisrael.
Rav Nachman of Breslov. Rav Nachman of Breslov was trying to move there. He famously abandoned his trip, but he was trying. I don't remember who was doing. Was it Mendel of the
I forgot what it was, but I think if those people had made what the state is there, then you could maybe this stuff would apply. But it's not.
But I don't. But again, at this point there are over 1 million of what you would call Haredim that live in Eretz Yisrael that are not Zionists, but still believe that it's a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. When I was living in Eretz Yisrael, almost all the poskim held that you have to live in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, Haredi poskim. I had my mashgiach. He was also the person who gave me my oral smicha test. His name was Rabbi Yoel Schwartz of blessed memory. He was our mashgiach in yeshiva, and it was my first year. I was going back for Pesach, and I just went to say goodbye and tell him I'm going home for Pesach. And he said, "Asur, it's forbidden. Why are you going to Chutz La'aretz?" So I said, "I'm going to honor my parents." He said, "Okay." But it was like, this is a position, even amongst Haredi halachic authorities in Israel, that you have to live in Eretz Yisrael. Many of them hold you have to live in Eretz Yisrael.
Rabbi,
The
idea that if you do establish living there, and I don't know what borders they're talking about, that you can't leave, which supposedly I heard that the Rebbe did not live there because he couldn't leave. I mean,
he held once you went there, you couldn't come back.
couldn't go, right.
Interesting. Anyways, these are obviously all complex questions. There's lots of room for discussion on all of them. I'm just going to end with the last case about the most recent, dramatic destroying Avodah Zarah drama. It was the burning of the Shaitels. And this was, I think, about 20 years ago. Word got out that a lot of the human hair wigs that women in the Frum community were wearing went through this particular idolatry. In other words, the hair itself was shorn from people who lived, I believe it was in India, but I'm not sure. It was somewhere where there was still full-blown idolatry, and that the hair was an offering, and then they would sell the hair in order to support the place. So word went out, and thousands and thousands of these human hair wigs were burnt. They burnt them, so as not to get benefit from something that was brought to Avodah Zarah. Clarification happened, but it took months. And eventually it was determined that they were not actually offered, because even the idolatry doesn't consider hair a proper offering. But rather there were barbers at these places that would shore your hair, and the money would be used to support the place. So it wasn't an actual offering to Avodah Zarah. It was like an indirect support of Avodah Zarah, and therefore the people didn't have to burn their wigs, but they did. And it was like a well-publicized event, and that was, I think, the most recent, very public thing about destroying the mitzvah, destroying Avodah Zarah. And again, I would not be surprised if there were stories about people who made a bracha and then burnt those shaitos, because it does seem like that bracha that is described, I think it's by Rabbi Kiva Eger, was put into use when people would destroy Avodah Zarah. So it's not just a theoretical subject. It has come out of practice. Although the actual destruction of a church in Israel, there have been apparently churches that were burnt in Israel by people who thought they were doing a mitzvah, but it wasn't something that was, as far as I know, not something that was halachically mandated. In other words, no posek, no halachic authority told people that they should burn churches, as far as I know. I know Meir Kahana brought it up. He was a rabbi. He brought it up in the Knesset, that we should be destroying these churches. I don't know if that amounts to a halachic authority in this discussion, but it did come up at that time when he was in the Knesset, which is going back like 40 something years ago, or 45 years ago. All right, if I can find something on Ava that gives us more parameters, then we'll do it. Otherwise, I guess we'll move on to the next mitzvah. I'm very grateful that you put up with me today, also with my brain tied behind my back. I'm very grateful that we had this discussion together. So our next class is Monday at 11. So this is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, this class. All right.
Rabbi, with
You're
your brain
welcome.
tied behind your back, you make it even for all of us. So, okay.
Thank you. That was my goal, to give everybody a say.
Thank you,
All right.
Rabbi.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Be well.
Bye all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.
Bye-bye. Bye, Jacob. bylaws in David.